The stars hung heavy above the broken moon, their distant fire casting fractured light over the desolate outpost that once sang with life and purpose. Now it was silent, save for the low, rasping breath of a being not born of earth, huddled beneath the collapsed dome of a shattered observatory. Her skin, a glistening shimmer of emerald and violet, was scorched in places where heat had licked too close. Her eyes wide obsidian, too large for her delicate face, darted in fear and disbelief as she stared at the soft hum of a shuttle's beacon pulsing in the distance. She was alone, not just on the outpost, but in a way that stretched beyond. Distance cut off from the others of her kind, abandoned after a failed diplomatic mission that had ended not in violence, but in mockery. For she had laughed at the human's tale, at the crude drawing he had made in the dust with a bent piece of metal, telling a story of gods who bled for mortals, mothers who lifted burning wreckage to save their young, people who fought not for conquest, but to protect what they loved. She had laughed because such things were illogical, absurd. The Council of Imkara taught that only strength mattered, cold, calculated dominion. And yet, as her transport took off without her, after a human mining drone she'd ridiculed exploded unexpectedly and collapsed the tunnel behind her, leaving her leg pinned and useless, the echo of that laughter now came back as shame. The cold burned worse than fire. The pain made her dizzy. And through the dust she saw a figure approaching a human, one she had ridiculed, dismissed, left without thanks the day before. He walked slowly, his suit patched with strips of faded flag colors, his face streaked with old tears and newer dirt. He didn't come armed. He came with a flask of water, a bag slung over his shoulder, and something even more dangerous to her than a plasma weapon. He came with kindness. And she, broken and alone, did not understand it. Why would he come back for her? Why would he? Help? The very idea made her heart tremble with something she had no name for. Somewhere in the distance, a solar flare rippled across the horizon like a warning or perhaps a beginning. Asterisk, he moved like someone used to walking among ruins, not just of metal and stone, but of people, of dreams, of things that had once mattered. His boots kicked up small clouds of powdered glass and lunar grit as he approached the collapsed structure where she lay, crumpled and half-buried. He didn't speak at first. He just knelt beside her, the orange faceplate of his helmet catching the thin light like a dying sun. With one careful movement, he set down the canvas bag and unscrewed the flask. Steam rose from it, not boiling, but warm enough to stave off death's grip. She flinched when he held it out, instinct warring with logic, her pupils straining, shouting in her mind that this was weakness, that trust was a luxury of the dominant. But then the warmth touched her cracked lips and flowed down her throat like liquid mercy, and her body betrayed her fear by leaning in. He said nothing until she had taken 3 sips. Then his voice came through the speaker, low and uneven, as if unused to being gentle. "You're lucky I still had signal out there. Mining satellite flagged a heat signature under this rock pile. Figured it might be you." She stared at him, blood oozing sluggishly from the gash on her cheekbone, watching this creature who had no reason to return. Why? She croaked, the word rough and broken. Why come back? He looked at her for a long time, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Because that's what we do," he said. "Even if you think it's stupid." He began to dig, hands wrapped in reinforced gloves, pulling away jagged beams and twisted wiring. His movements were precise, methodical, but not detached. He grunted with effort, swore under his breath when a beam sliced across his arm. She noticed the tremor in his fingers, the wear in his joints. This wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. This was a worker, a survivor, one of the ones who stayed after the glory days passed. And now he was here, bleeding and sweating for someone who had mocked everything he believed. "The story," she said faintly, remembering the dusty lines he had drawn. "It was nonsense." He paused, met her gaze. "Yeah," he said, wiping his brow. "A lot of our stories are. But sometimes nonsense is all we've got left. And sometimes that's enough to save someone." He kept digging, and she didn't stop him. Asterisk, the days on the fractured moon were long, stitched together by pale light and aching silence. Time didn't pass in hours anymore, it passed in breaths, in the slow healing of wounds and the slow breaking of walls. He built a shelter beside the ruins, piecing it together from spare hull panels, salvaged wires, and the stubbornness that seemed stitched into his very bones. Each morning, he would check her injury, clean it with trembling hands, and mutter softly to her, even when she didn't respond. At first, she resisted his kindness like it was a toxin. Her people were trained from childhood to see emotion as noise, as interference. She was a diplomatic observer of the Makara Nexus, trained in 1,000 languages and immune to the sickness of sentiment. But this human he didn't act like any other species they had catalogued. He wasn't logical, or careful, or hierarchical. He was messy, soft, infuriating, and yet he kept bringing her water. He shared his rations, even though they tasted like ash to her. He sat beside her during the long nights and told stories real ones, sometimes broken, sometimes angry. He told her about the fire on Europa Station, how he'd carried his brother's body through the smoke and held onto it until rescue came, even though there was nothing left to save. He told her how Earth wasn't the shining center of galactic power anymore, but how people still woke up, still built things, still dreamed. He told her how stories had saved him when reason failed, how belief had kept his hands moving long after logic said give up. She didn't know when she started listening, truly listening. Maybe it was the night he fell asleep, sitting up, his back to the solar wind, keeping her shielded though his own suit hissed with a slow leak. Maybe it was when she woke, screaming from fever, and he gripped her hand without hesitation, whispering words she didn't understand but felt in her bones. Maybe it was the day she asked him in a whisper to draw that foolish story again, the one about the mother lifting fire to save her child. This time, he drew it with her finger in the dust. And she didn't laugh. Something changed in her. Something broke open, tender and raw. She told him about her home, about the cold towers of judgment where her people calculated worth and discarded imperfection. She told him how she had always felt like a shard of glass in a machine of steel. And when she cried, just once, her tears shimmered like liquid stars. He didn't say a word. He just took her hand and let the silence carry them both. Asterisk it began, with a strange hum deep beneath the crust barely noticeable at first, like the whisper of some ancient engine stirring in its grave. The human, whose name she now knew as Eli, paused mid-repair of a solar panel and tilted his head. She had grown used to the sound of his breathing, the scratch of his tools, the rhythm of his mumbling, but this was different. It wasn't a machine. It was deeper, older, alive. By the time they traced it to a forgotten mine shaft carved by early colonists, the resonance had grown stronger, vibrating through the dust like a pulse. They ventured closer, her limp steadied by a brace he'd fashioned from ship debris, and found a shaft sealed by a heavy panel etched with forgotten warnings and ancient Terran glyphs. Eli brushed them off with a frown, and she read them aloud. In a trembling voice, containment breach, not salvageable. Do not disturb, but it was already too late. The flare from the satellite hadn't just been a solar disturbance, it had cracked a deep fault, destabilizing the prison below. Eli turned slowly toward her, his eyes wide with something she hadn't seen in him before, not fear, but a kind of terrible recognition. He told her about the early human experiments on this moon, how they had tried to build fusion reactors powered by harvested quantum singularities, how one of them had gone wrong, not with an explosion, but with something worse. With something that learned. A consciousness made of energy and rage, born from broken laws of physics, sealed and buried when containment failed. We didn't tell anyone, he said bitterly. Not even our allies. It was covered up like everything else back then. They thought the moon was dead. Turns out we just locked the devil in the basement and walked away. Her people had come here thinking it was an abandoned research site, ripe for reclamation. The mission hadn't just failed because of her laughter. It had failed because the Menkara had stumbled too close to the old wound of human hubris, and now it was waking. The hum grew sharper with each hour. Lights flickered. Magnetic interference made their comms useless. Her kind would never come back for her now. They would have scanned the disturbance and deemed the site corrupted. And still, Eli stayed. We have to warn someone, she said, gripping his arm. He nodded slowly, but his eyes were already scanning the land around them, calculating. There's a relay tower still standing on the ridge. Old tech, but it might reach the nearest outpost. She looked at him, at the man who'd once been just a joke to her people. Now he was all she had. You'll go? She asked. Eli smiled grimly, slinging on his gear. We'll go, he said. Together? The climb to the ridge was brutal. Gravity on the fractured moon wasn't kind. It jerked and twisted with every step, uneven from tectonic wounds left by failed mining experiments long ago. Eli helped her as best he could, bearing most of her weight, though his breathing grew ragged and sharp. The relay tower loomed above like a rusted spear stabbed into the sky, its frame bent by decades of storms and neglect. But it stood. It still stood. That gave them hope, even as the hum beneath the ground grew into a growl. The energy was rising now, swirling with a hunger that was no longer subtle. Rocks trembled. Dust lifted and spun in tiny vortexes around. Their feet. Every step they took seemed to stir the buried mind below. At the base of the tower, Eli pried open the old access panel. Circuits crackled beneath his gloves. He grunted as he fed power from his own suit into the panel, rerouting every last drop of energy. She stood watch, leaning heavily on a splintered pole, watching the black horizon for signs of movement, though she wasn't sure if what they feared would even have a shape. She turned to him. What if it's too late? She asked, her voice brittle. What if the signal doesn't reach? Anyone? Eli paused his work, looking up at her, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Then we make it mean something anyway, he said, even if nobody hears it, even if we're the only ones who know. The system sparked, flickered, then hummed to life. A thin blue light pulsed up the antenna. A signal burst into the dark, a scream across the stars. But the moment was short-lived. The ridge beneath them cracked like an egg. A violent tremor surged upward, throwing them both to the ground. The energy below had heard, and it was angry. A thin beam of light shot into the sky a mile away, a vertical wound that hissed with plasma and broken time. She screamed as the pulse tore across the horizon, lighting up the sky like an aurora of pain. Eli grabbed her hand, pulling her up. But then she saw the gash in his side where the fall had torn open his suit. Oxygen hissed out in a deadly stream. He pressed one hand to it, staggering. Go, he said through gritted teeth. I'll slow it down, get it away from here. She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. I won't leave you. You have to, he said. You're the one who has to carry the story. You're the one who can make them believe. If anyone hears you, if anyone believes what humans are, then maybe this place doesn't end in silence. He took a breath, the last clean one he might ever have, and smiled through the pain. Tell them we tried. Tell them we didn't run. And then he stood, wounded and unarmed, facing the rising fire alone. Asterisk, the sky split open as the entity rose. No shape, no form, just pulsing waves of light and hate. Like thought without conscience, rage without language. It had once been a machine, perhaps, built by human hands to touch the edge of the impossible. But that purpose had long since melted into madness. Now it was raw energy bound to memory, a storm that remembered being caged. It screamed without sound, a ripple in space itself, and as it tore across the ridge, Eli stood in its path. Blood poured from his side, his suit failing in silent warnings. Still he stood, not with weapons, but with resolve. He didn't run, didn't hide, didn't curse the sky. He activated the last flare beacon in his suit and drove it spike into the ground, a final burning signal that marked him not as an enemy, not as prey, but as a witness. A defiance carved into time itself. She watched from the broken mouth of a cave just below the ridge, her hands trembling, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she saw. No one from her species had ever stood like that, so small, so breakable, yet unyielding in front of a force they couldn't even name. Her people would have analyzed, calculated, withdrawn, but Eli chose to face it, alone, the energy twisted. Toward him, tendrils of heat and force coiling like serpents, searching for weakness, and still, Eli didn't flinch. His voice, hoarse and broken, burst over his suit speaker. You don't win by surviving, he said, speaking not to the thing before him, but to everything it represented. You win by choosing what's worth dying for. And with the last strength he had, he triggered the secondary charge beneath. The Flare homemade EM disruption pulse built from salvage mining gear. The explosion wasn't loud, but it cracked the sky with a shockwave of silence. The creature buckled, flickered, recoiled. For a moment, just one, it stuttered. Not destroyed, not banished, but confused. Disrupted. Slowed. Abizove. Needed. Enough for the signal to escape. Enough for someone to hear. Enough for her to live. As the fire died down and the ridge fell silent, she crawled toward the crater. There was nothing left of him but ash and memory. Yet she wept not with despair, but with reverence. For in that final stand, Eli had not just saved her, he had changed her. He had become something her people would never understand. Not a warrior. Not a martyr, but a human. A true one. Asterisk, she walked alone across the pale waste, the ridge a smoldering scar behind her, the wind thin and sharp like whispered ghosts. The beacon tower still pulsed faintly above, its signal cast out into the abyss. Calling to ears she could only hope still listened. Days blurred, nights passed in silence. But she carried him with her, not just in memory, not just in the fragments of blood-stained cloth she wrapped into her robes, but in her breath, in her bones, in something she had once called nonsense and now understood as sacred. When the rescue ship came, Empira, sleek and cold like always, they brought scanning drones, armed escorts, containment modules. They did not expect her to be alive. They did not expect the story she carried. They questioned her with sterile words, asked for data, for proof. She gave them something else. She knelt in the dust and drew his story again. The crude lines he'd carved into the soil, the figure who burned for love, the hand that lifted fire to save another. She spoke of Eli, of how he stayed when he had no reason, of how he gave everything not because he calculated the odds, but because it was right. At first, they laughed. Not cruelly, but with the soft condescension of those who still believed. Themselves evolved beyond empathy, she let them laugh, because that's how she had begun too, and like her, they would learn. She left the service, abandoned her role in the diplomatic corps. She wandered the edge worlds, telling his story. Not polished, not glorified, just as it was. Brutal, foolish, beautiful. Other species began to listen, not because the tale was perfect, but because it felt true. And in the listening, something shifted, not quickly. Not in parades or treaties, but in whispers, in quiet places, where stories mattered, where belief began. Years later, long after, her skin dulled and her limbs aged, a monument rose on the fractured moon, not grand, not funded by empires, but built stone by those who came after. It bore no name, only a symbol, an open hand drawn in dust. Below it, in a dozen tongues, a phrase repeated, "He stayed." And far across the stars, where fires still burned and war still raged, Eli's story spread. Not because it promised victory, but because it reminded those who had forgotten that humanity's strength was never in its weapons, but in its willingness to bleed for someone else's chance to live.